I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think something that I'll just start off with is that the fact of like what do we actually prefer in this debate, right? I think in our world we prefer the fact that a lot of people like post less superficial content. It looks like a world like when 10 years ago we didn't have a bunch of influencers trying to sell you products all the time, right? I think this looks like the fact that content creators and like pure hardcore influencers are very different things, right? I think that yes, we do have a lot of content creators that do rely on sponsorships, right? But I think the difference from this fact and like the difference from the fact and the difference in what influencers actually do is that on content creators, they actually create content, and most of the time they rely on their content for them to actually make money, right? So they don't actually exclusively rely on these brand deals and these sponsorships, right? But we think that secondly, even if we do accept their like characterization of how these like influences or like these how these influences look like and how they can actually quote unquote like educate people, right? We still think that we regret the rise of this influencer culture, right? We don't think that influencer culture necessarily associates like not Mr. Beast, but like Mark Rober and other educational YouTubers in that fact, right? And I think the fact that like they mentioned Billie Eilish when she's not even an influencer, she's a singer, she got famous for her singing, is something that you should also recognize is very different from an influencer, right? We already clearly characterized to you in first speaker that an influencer is somebody who uses their online platform to basically sell you stuff, right? They use their online platform to create the superficial persona that they're like the most beautiful person in the world, right? While creating unrealistic beauty standards at the same time, right? And later in my speech, I'm going to tell you the impacts of this, why we think that this is extremely important, and how this damages the mental health of so many young like people in general, right? I think like first of all, right, we tell you that number one, like I think the fact that it creates a toxic platform which heavily impacts the mental health of young impressionable people is something that will expand on from my first speaker, right? I think they cannot simply brush off the fact that there are like other influences that promote like body positivity, because I know the fact that like even though influences like Clara Dow exist, right, I think like the exact fact that she uses her appearance mainly for her content is exactly the problem that lies with influencer culture and status quo, right? I think the fact that Clara Dow, I think the fact like Kim Kardashian, who we would consider like started this whole trend of like influencer culture in general, like heavily focused on their appearance and not actually having a real persona like other singers or actors or A-list celebrities, right? I think the fact that they rely on their content creation is exactly the problem we have with influencer culture in the first place, right? I think something that we have to like differ is that we're not necessarily against these influencers as a whole. We're just against the rise of like the oversaturation of influences in this current day and age, right? I think, okay, first of all, right, we tell you it creates a toxic platform which encourages and heavily exploits people who basically use social media as an escape from their really bad life, right? We tell you why they're incentivized to look good in the first place, right? We tell you that the influencer culture is highly competitive because of its easy accessibility, because of how everyone can easily access like TikTok or Instagram, right? How it seems so easy to become an influencer, but in reality, you have to look to this certain standard, right? You have to look this or that, right? And I think the fact that social media is built around the fact that you have to look aesthetically good, right? The fact that we have so many different filters on TikTok that make you look like to a certain beauty standard, that basically wrap around a certain beauty standard, I think just proves to you that the social media and like influencer culture does reinforce these beauty standards, right? We tell you the impacts of this are like substantial, right? Because we tell you when people heavily rely on social media for like, you know, escapism or whatever, right? We tell you that it puts them in a state of body dysmorphia, and we tell you that it obviously worsens their mental health, right? And I think that this is something that really matters in this debate, right? Because I think the exact reason why Australia is planning to ban like social media for those under 16 is exactly because of this reason, because of this hope like hyper curated feed of like very beautiful people and people who look aesthetically good, right? With while trying to promote products that perhaps make you look quote unquote better, right? Or like maybe like, you know, those courses online that tell you how to look quote unquote looks max, which cost like an exorbitant amount of money, I think are just like some of the things that influencers tries to push onto their audience, right? We tell you that these beauty standards are extremely harmful, right? Because we tell you that it harms the mental health of a lot of people, which is why many governments have actually started this trend of trying to ban like social media for those under the age of like 16, right? And we think that secondly, we think that not just like people or people who consume this influencer content, right? But we tell you this is also harmful to influencers as well, right? Because we think that because it's so the as optical of an influencer looks so easy to access, right? That I can just buy a camera one day and start becoming an influencer because of all the easy money that I could possibly get, right? We tell you this is extremely harmful for a lot of people, right? We tell you the main demographic of people who actually want to become influencers are those who generally, like, I generally see that, you know, being an influencer is something that will give them easy money. Or we think that secondly, like, being an influencer is something that like that is something that is like a result that they go to when they don't have money in the first place, right? And we tell you this is harmful. Why, right? We tell you because like it feeds this false narrative that this wealth and this fame is so easy to access, and that like everybody will be able to find fame and fortune, right? I think especially because of the fact that a lot of influencers promote their flashy houses, right? The fact that influencer culture actually led to the rise in this culture of so on, like, quote unquote, like flexing, right? Where a person generally shows off their wealth, like their fancy cars or their fancy houses, for example, right? We tell you that this is harmful for a lot of people, right? Especially influencers, right? We tell you this is harmful because we think that they end up getting into an industry that won't necessarily pay them well, right? Because we think that, first of all, obviously because of the fact that they have to look extremely beautiful to become an influencer, I think number one, they often end up failing, especially when they're in an industry that's so oversaturated with so many influences and status quo, right? But we think that secondly, right, especially when they rely on a lot of like sponsorships and brand deals, right, we tell you this is bad because they often take up very, very bad brand deals, right? And we think that this feeds into this whole like quote unquote like gig economy, which is potentially really bad, right? Okay, lastly, just like to wrap up, right, we tell you this is bad, right, because we tell you that a lot of them end up taking like brand deals which don't necessarily pay much because they actually need the, you know, they need the validation from these brand deals that they are a qualified influencer, right? Because remember that these influencers rely on their brand portfolio of brands sponsoring them in order to be qualified as a someone like quote unquote like influencer, right? But we tell you that like they also feed into this narrative that there's a beauty standard, that it's harmful, and that it actually feeds into the bad mental health of a lot of people in the world. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you.